Well, hi, everybody. Good morning or good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm the Vice President for Asia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual discussion of the Chinese economy, and to put it pithily, paraphrasing President Donald Trump, how China can grow again after a pretty dismal first quarter in which the economy contracted by 6.8%. I'm joined for this by two of Carnegie's very best, our two China-focused economists, Michael Pettis from our Carnegie Tsinghua Center in Beijing, and Yukon Huang from our Carnegie Center in Washington. Both of these Carnegie scholars are no doubt very well known to you. They're prolific and frequent commentators on the Chinese economy. They're both senior fellows at Carnegie. Michael's also a professor of finance at Peking University's Guanghua School of Management. Yukon is a former World Bank country director for China. Among other things, they're widely published and they're widely respected. Now, just to set this up, as I said, China's coming out of a pretty rough first quarter. Officially, it showed a 6.8% contraction, and the various measures that the government has put into place with a growing sense of urgency seem, to me at least, and I'll be curious how you guys see it, to reflect at least two key factors. First, poor economic and social indicators since the beginning of the year, which not only have been fairly weak, but are particularly weak when viewed in historical terms. And second, what I would describe as a political imperative to support the most vulnerable businesses and sectors of the economy, and above all, those that are connected to the workforce and supporting employment growth. And so, consistent with what at least I see as a theme that we've had since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, we've had a lot of emphasis on employment and quality of life indicators, and not just growth for growth's sake. And there's a lot of talk about the so-called six stabilities, including of employment, of finance, of both foreign and domestic investment. And we've just had the Premier Li Keqiang give his annual work report to the National People's Congress, in which, while the headlines were mainly about the lack of a growth target for this year, I think the bigger story was perhaps his emphasis on employment. And if you look at his statement, he kept referring to a so-called employment first policy. So there have been a raft of measures that I think flow from that to support vulnerable businesses in vulnerable sectors, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, which at least official figures suggest constitute about 80% of urban employment and 80 to 90% of total domestic enterprises. So that's things like deferring payments for water, gas, electricity, reducing Social Security premiums, extending loans, providing tax relief, and so on. All of which brings us both to the state of the economy today and then where we're going from here. So I thought, guys, maybe the best place to start this would be to ask you each in turn to spend a little time on how you view the present state of the economy. We're in June of 2020. China's trying to normalize and claw its way back to growth out of the pandemic. So maybe I'll start with Michael and then go to Yukon and just spend a few minutes talking about how you see the present state of the economy and how you assess the leadership's immediate directives around growth, employment, support for vulnerable sectors. And then we can begin to flow into a longer term conversation about where they're headed. So Michael, can we start with you? Give us your assessment of how things stand now.
Well, I think your assessment of the NPC was absolutely correct. China didn't announce a GDP growth target this year, but the claim some people have that they've abandoned the growth target is, I think, simply not true. What they've been unable, given still all of the uncertainty associated with COVID-19 and the impact on the global economy, et cetera, they've been unable to give us a GDP growth target. But they did say that GDP growth would be positive this year. And given that the what I would call the good sources of growth, consumption, exports, business investment, are almost all certainly going to be down this year, that component of GDP growth would be negative for the year. And the fact that they're pretty certain we're going to have positive growth implies that we're going to do a lot of the traditional things that China has done, to the extent that they're able to, given monetary constraints. But we're going to see investment in infrastructure. We're going to see probably a revival of real estate development, et cetera, et cetera. The issue you bring up, that of unemployment, I think is certainly key. I think Keqiang and a number of other people have made it very clear that what they're most concerned about is unemployment. Although, as I'm sure you know, it's been really hard to get good figures on exactly the employment consequence or the unemployment consequence of COVID-19. That we're still waiting to get a sense of. I've lost you.
I muted my microphones to eliminate feedback. So now you can hear me. Yukon, why don't we turn to you? What's your sense of the state of play now?
I think that the policy position is more or less what one would have expected. But you have a first quarter minus 6.8%. This quarter is probably still going to be negative. The government really does want to get growth rates into the positive areas. But the range of forecasts of China's growth this year range widely. Some would say that the full year outcome might be as low as -5. And then you have Justin Lin at Beida, who's basically arguing that it could be as high as 3 to 4%. My personal view is it'll be lucky. China will be lucky if growth can get into the positive areas. So their estimates, I think, of 0 to 1% are probably more realistic. The question is, what can China do about it? It cannot push out a lot of credit as it did in the global financial crisis. Its debt ratio is a little bit too high, so it's been actually relatively prudent. So it's focused much more upon fiscal expansion, funding of local governments, traditional infrastructure, and the budget, which was basically endorsed by the party Congress meetings, set a fiscal deficit number which is historically higher than normal. But a lot of the actual funding doesn't show up in terms of those statistics. But you'll see bond increases, and they've just surged recently, and you'll see a lot of local infrastructure funding increases. The problem here is that you cannot rely upon trade pulling up the economy, so you rely much more upon consumption. But consumption is lagging. Many households are basically concerned about what's going to happen. They're not spending as much as people would like. The government's hope for a V-shaped recovery is certainly no longer possible. The question is, how long is the so-called U-shape going to be, or is it going to be a W? Because you may have rebounding, we don't know. As Michael said, and you emphasized, employment is the issue. Unemployment numbers don't tell us the problem. So you look at what I would call what the government looks at, and that's job creation in the urban sector. And for the first time, they've set employment numbers for the urban sector lower than people had expected, something like 9 million. The problem is you have probably something like 20 to 40 million migrant workers who are floating around. Some have come back to their cities, but unable to find jobs. Some have not actually returned. But the issue is, how do you provide jobs for them? And that's going to be very, very difficult when the trade sector is depressed. Many of them are working in major cities, and they're working in activities related to trade. They don't have any likely permanent positions back home. The social system doesn't actually address their needs. Employment systems, these kinds of welfare systems don't actually help migrant workers. And the government is a bit reluctant, actually, to provide the necessary funding. So I think employment is the vulnerability. Consumption is lagging. The question is, can they get local governments to stimulate infrastructure investment? A little bit limited. Can they rely upon the housing market, property market? These are all difficult issues because the property is also overextended. So on balance, I would say they have a tough time trying to make what I call a positive growth target for this year.
I want to push you each on some of the things you said before we move on. So for Yukon, this thing about the labor market is interesting. It seems to me they've got two vulnerabilities in particular that have political resonance, right? Not just labor market resonance. So one, as you said, is migrant workers who've been particularly caught up because of the pandemic. And then the second are college graduates, urban elites. But I've noticed that the kind of measure, you pick up a Chinese newspaper these days, there's all kind of stuff about college job fairs, trying to push enterprises, particularly urban enterprises, to hire college graduates. Talk a little bit about what the policy menu looks like. If you're sitting in the government, you're Li Keqiang, you're Han Zheng, you're worried about employment, you're worried about political vulnerabilities as a result of this. What are the policy tools they have to not just be passive bystanders that can actually push along kind of employment growth now for particularly those vulnerable sectors?
No, you're absolutely right. Migrant workers are one big social group that they worry a lot about. Uh, the young college graduates are politically more worrisome. They are in the urban centers. They're connected with the potential urban elites, the professional classes, the businesses, the government. They have set guidelines telling companies and the government to continue recruiting, and they set percentages of new recruits, targeting some of these basically new graduates. They had the same problem during the Asian financial crisis, after the global financial crisis. But those periods of time, the market was never as depressed as is likely to be now. So I think you pinpointed a problem. I don't think they can actually deal with it very easily. These workers are scrambling around trying to find jobs, and as you noted, press articles and interviews show that they're having a very difficult time. It's quite difficult because they actually had this problem now for a number of years. The government's been encouraging them to go much more into private sector activities, informal services kind of activities, but these are precisely the areas where the pandemic has been the strongest. So I think this is an issue that's not going to be easy to tackle. And I don't think they can actually solve it actually in the short run. It's going to be a problem that's going to last for at least a couple of years.
Michael, you want to jump in on any of that, or think you're muted?
I'm muted. You're right.
There you
go. For me, the problem is, I guess, that's the type of instruments that they're using to resolve this. There's tons of talk about boosting consumption, boosting domestic demand, which in China really means boosting consumption. Consumption as private sector investment tends to fall with changes in consumption. We see it almost every day in daily, more proposals to boost consumption. For example, today, they announced, this is a little bizarre, but they announced that one of the largest department stores in China will now be permitted to sell duty-free goods, not just the airports, but in department stores within the big cities. One who's traveled less than 180 days ago. We're seeing lots of proposals of this. I'm sure you know there's been a lot of talk about consumption coupons by local governments, local municipalities. The problem with all of these demand side solution, that's really what China needs, is sort of demand side boost. The problem is that they're really tiny. Looking at the consumption programs, the consumption voucher programs, the biggest one was Beijing's, and they announced a program very recently, a few days ago, which I did the math, and it added up to about 1/3 of 1% of Beijing's GDP. Tianjin, with an announcement a week earlier, was 1/3 of 1 basis point of Tianjin's GDP. So these demand side measures, which they're making a lot of noise, have been really small and really limited. They're focusing mostly on what all supply side measures. They're trying to get them to lend more to small companies. They're trying to lower the financing costs. They're spending on infrastructure, then corporate taxes, et cetera. Even these supply side measures are being presented as boosting. In fact, consumption has become a word a little bit like technology or solar energy several years ago, in which you invoke to justify any kind of spending. And my favorite example was 3 days ago, the Ministry of Transportation, so that they were going to take steps to boost consumption. And what does that involve? It involves more spending on transportation and on logistics, things like that, which is really not a demand policy. It's much more supply side policy. There are arguments that if we build more road lines, we're going to hire people, and there we have to pay them, and therefore that boosts consumption. But that's not true. What you're doing is you're boosting the supply side more than you're boosting the demand side. And if China were a small country, perhaps they could get it. But the problem globally, there's a real constraint there. What they really needs is major demand side boost. And to the extent that that exporting countries, because I think it's just China doing this, are focusing on trying to resolve the demand side by stronger boosts on the supply side. The risk is that we simply worsen the global imbalance. And certainly the trade numbers in the last couple of months have been pretty worse. In May, China's surplus was roughly 5.3% of GDP, $63 billion. It's a huge number. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's an inevitable cause of the way they're trying to address the problem. So my concern is not just that there is a slowdown in the economy, but that the solution to slow down in the economy is to win the imbalances that they've been trying to resolve, for 13 years now, and of course to significantly to worsen the debt China has. Let me just say one last thing about the debt, and that is that last year was not a good year for debt. According to Beijing's number, the debt to GDP ratio rose a little bit more than 6 percentage points to around, I think it's 245% of GDP. This year, doing really simple conservative calculations, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt where that I can't come up with numbers that are less than 12 to 18 percentage point deterioration in the debt to GDP ratio, which is a really terrible deterioration in the ratio. But I think that's what we're going to see. I don't really way around it.
Can we maybe, Yukon, that's a good segment. Can we talk about indebtedness a little bit in the economy? Because it's a longstanding problem, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how they manage it, and particularly what it means, because it begins to get us into the relationship with the state and private sector and what they do, not with the central state-owned enterprise, but with these thousands of provincial and local state-owned enterprises that are not efficient, that are a drag on the economy. I used to work for Hank Paulson, and Hank used to have a joke. He'd say, in the United States, doing a bailout is the politically brave thing to do because they're so unpopular. But in China, not doing a bailout is the politically brave thing to do because the impulse is always to bail out these enterprises. And so you have a different kind of moral hazard problem. And I'm wondering, particularly if the trajectory on debt is the way Michael says it is, how are they going to get out of that? And how are they going to find the political stomach to get themselves out of that, particularly at the local level, and particularly in a post-pandemic environment? You're muted, Yukon. We're going to learn.
That overhang has been a problem, confounding the policymakers and the markets for almost a decade. Go back 10 years ago, and you see that a very rapid surge in China's debt to GDP ratios. And in China, the focus has been on corporate, government, household debt. And much of that increase has been in the state corporate sector, and much of that in the corporate sector has been state enterprises. Government debt ratios are still relatively what I call manageable in a global context. Household debt ratios have surged because of the property market and mortgages, and they become much more of what I would call a normal economy. Before, it didn't really exist. But it's the corporate sector that drives people crazy. So you have an increase in the debt GDP ratio going from 200% of GDP to 300% of GDP. 150% of that increase is basically the state sector. The question then becomes, what is the so-called state sector? Is it really these state enterprises trying to do what I call semi-commercial, commercial activities, zombie companies, which are basically financially dead, but the government pours in money? Or is it actually disguised in the form of local governments are actually doing much of the borrowing? Remember, local governments in China cannot borrow officially. So what they do is they create infrastructure financing vehicles, who borrow on their behalf, and these entities use local government land to basically get funding from financial intermediaries. Now, this borrowing shows up as state enterprise borrowing. So they're the same category as state enterprises, and you can't tell, therefore, whether the borrowing is really driven by local governments or driven by SOEs of what I would call supposedly commercial in nature. My view is roughly half and half. But this became a real problem. And a lot of this borrowing was occurring through what I call shadow banking. Remember, shadow banking, lending outside of the normal traditional banking channels to trust funds, other kinds of modes of financial products, soared from global financial crisis period on. It didn't exist before then. But this was driving actually most of the debt surge. And a lot of this was done by enterprises, and a lot of this went into the property market. So about 2 or 3 years ago, the government really came down hard on this kind of financial expansion. They put a real tight lid on shadow lending. Shadow lending more or less evaporated over the last year or two. So China's debt GDP ratio moderated and actually came down slightly a year or so ago. So now again, we're in the pandemic phase of expansionary policies. Michael's right, expansion or forecast of the debt GDP ratio is that it may increase by 20 percentage points to GDP over the coming year or two. But 20 percentage points increase is actually comparable to what's going on globally. So the IMF and World Bank have come out with numbers suggesting that most economies, their debt to GDP ratios will increase by 20% this year. And then the question is, who is vulnerable, who is not vulnerable? China is still in the category of not actually being seen as a problem. There are other countries which clearly are a problem. And the answers are what we've known before. Interest rates are relatively low, so it's more manageable. And a lot of this debt is basically guaranteed by the state, and there are a lot of assets in the state. It's a continued difficult problem. It's getting worse because of the pandemic and the expansionary policies, but still not what I would call in a crisis mode. The problem is going to be, ultimately, is the government going to make use of this debt in a different way? And we don't know the answer to that one, because a lot of this going into the traditional infrastructure and property market. The property market is saturated. They really can't do this. So Michael's actually correct in the sense there's a demand issue. Demand issue being, what are sensible things that you can spend this money on that's sort of sustainable? And I think this is becoming a much more difficult problem for China in terms of the future. Before, they would just say, build it and they will come. They no longer can say that.
So, Michael, you may want to address those points directly, but I can also see two directions you might take that in. One is this question of de-risk, not just deleveraging, but really de-risking the financial system in China. They keep talking about deleveraging. What's the state of that? But second, because you've had a lot to say about it recently in the Financial Times and elsewhere, how you see this kind of debate about state, private. People talk about Xi Jinping, they go, oh, he's a statist. How do you see the pathway for state-owned enterprise reform, if at all, in China? And how are they doing on getting the balance right? And what's the trajectory that they're on? What do they need to do? And you're muted again. You're muted. No, we can't. No microphone. Okay. We'll see if we can get you back. All right. Well, Michael, you're lighting up, but you're not. We're not hearing you. So I may throw that to Yukon if we can't get your microphone on.
Yes. Let me go back to this
Sure.
this heated debate about the role of the state sector. Up to about the global financial crisis period, the indicators suggested that the private sector was flourishing. And the key indicator that people were relying upon were credit flows. Much more credit is going to the private sector. Now, you have to differentiate between what you mean by the private sector. Some of it is what I call lending to households. And that's basically the property market. And there are firms in the property market. And that surged during the construction boom. And that drove up the lending to the private sector. The other is basically lending to corporates, industrial corporates. And this is very heavily tied to exports, the trade surging. So you had this trade flow, property market flow increase, lending to the private sector surged. And people were basically saying China's become more private sector oriented. After the global financial crisis, China is now entering an economic slowdown. So its focus is on basically expansionary policies. Now, under expansionary policies, the government basically is relying upon monetary flows to the banking sector, a lot of it targeting state enterprises. The other vehicle targeting local governments for infrastructure. So this eventually shows up as credit flows to the state. And this has been actually steadily increasing over the last 7 or 8 years. And this has generated debate, as you mentioned, that the government is now moving to a state-driven growth model rather than a private sector. I would actually say that really this is not reflective of what I would call any kind of an ideological shift in the last 7 or 8 years. It's basically what happens to fiscal monetary policies as you go from a boom cycle to a contractionary cycle when you want to stimulate the economy. The question still remains, does the country want to rely or continue to have a major presence in the enterprise sector through state-owned assets? Does it want to still control the ownership of these assets? What does it want to do with its authority in terms of who can do what? That hasn't really changed in the last 10 or 15 years. So I think this focus on credit flows, and whether it's private or state, actually doesn't really address the more fundamental issue in terms of what the government's intentions are in terms of the future. In some sense, I don't think that really has changed.
Michael, I'm hoping we've got your audio back. No audio. All right.
Maybe Michael should try to reconnect.
Yeah, I think, why don't we do that, Michael? Do you want to try to reconnect and see if we get a better audio connection for you? Because we have your video, but no audio. This is the age of Zoom, ladies and gentlemen, and Microsoft Teams and all of these video services that we use. So.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we are, Michael, we have you back. Here's the headphones.
I got these really expensive high-tech headphones, and it turns out that something cheaper would have been better. To go back to the question that you asked me about the sort of nationalization of the economy, I think there are some misconceptions there. I don't really think that it was ever really a policy of Xi Jinping to reduce the private sector and strengthen the public sector. I think that was based on a bunch of misunderstandings. 2 years ago, there was a lot of concern because SOEs were acquiring some of their related private sector companies. But I don't think, in fact, I'm pretty sure there was no policy to do that. It was a very desperate attempt to resolve a really big problem that had developed in 2015. And that is with the huge stock market boom. It turns out that a lot of owners of SMEs had borrowed heavily against their shares, probably to use the money to fund outflows. At least that's what everyone says. And the problem was that as the market started to come down, that put enormous pressure on these companies. And there was real concern that many of these companies would technically go bankrupt. And Beijing did not want them to go bankrupt, but it didn't know what to do. And their first pass was really to have SOEs take over related companies. But that was never sort of an overall plan. That was because they didn't know what else to do. By the end of 2018, however, they had come to some kind of resolution, which was to force banks to make medium-term loans to the owners, uncollateralized by shares, the proceeds of which would be used to repay the collateralized loans. And ever since then, we stopped seeing that gradual takeover. Now, does that mean that we aren't seeing a nationalization of the Chinese economy? We are, but not because that's what Li Keqiang or Xi Jinping want, but simply because given the structure of the economy and given very weak domestic demand, that's the only thing they can do. And by that, I mean, if you want GDP growth in China to be higher than whatever the real comparable growth rate of the economy is, one of the things I always tell my clients is that GDP growth does not mean in China what it means in other countries. In other countries, it's an output. It's the economy does what it does, and you measure certain things, and that tells you the change in GDP over the period. In China, that's not what happens. It's a systems input. We know what GDP growth is going to be because we're told in the December before the year that it happens. And what happens in China is that because you don't have hard budget constraints and because you have near infinite borrowing capacity, you don't, but you have enough borrowing capacity that China can achieve any growth target it wants, largely because it doesn't have to write down bad investments. And that's because it doesn't have hard budget constraints. If you imagine two Chinas that are identical in every way, the only difference is an accounting difference. In the first China, you have to write down bad investment more or less in line with the rest of the world, maybe not perfectly, but in line with the rest of the world. And in the second China, which is the China we live in, you don't have to do that. Those two Chinas, even though I define them as economically identical, don't show the same GDP growth rates. The first one will show a lower GDP growth rate than the second one. And the point is that if you want that second China to grow faster than the first one, in other words, if you want a GDP growth target that is above the real underlying growth rate of the economy, then there's simply no way you can do it without an expanding state sector, because it involves investing in non-productive activity. And the private sector isn't going to do that. The private sector has no interest in doing that. In fact, they may be disinvesting. So the public sector has to expand to achieve the GDP growth target. And by the way, that's going to happen again this year. Even though we don't have a GDP growth target, an explicit one, we have an implicit GDP growth target. They promised us that growth would be positive. I suspect it'll be in the 2 to 3% region, but whatever. But it's still going to be significantly above the real underlying growth rate, even more so than it was last year. So as a result, we'll see a continued expansion of the state sector. But the point I want to make is that it's not a program of the government. They don't have a choice. As long as they select GDP growth rates that are higher than the real underlying growth rate of the economy, the state sector has to expand.
Yukon, I know you want to jump in on this, and then I want to jump in on this too. So I'll go to Yukon first.
Yeah. I just want to point out that some of the criticism or concern about the state-private mix reflects observations about policy intentions unfulfilled. If you go back 5 or 6 years ago when President Xi Jinping came into power, there was this famous third plenum statement. And in there, it talked about the fact that market forces should become more dominant in terms of the allocation of resources. And many observers feel that's not been the case. So that's one concern. The second point that people have been focusing on, they go back to around the time of the WTO entry, when Zhu Rongji basically decided to reform state enterprises by letting a lot of what I call the commercially oriented small state enterprises, locally controlled or owned, go. And that basically reduced the size of the state. This hasn't really happened. Instead, what people then focus on is the fact that the Communist Party is now putting in officials into all companies, and not just state enterprises, but now private enterprises. So there is a sense that the intention to let the market or private sector flourish really hasn't been acted upon, and the reluctance at the very top to actually move forward. So I think this is part of the issue that people are looking at, independent of what I would call the credit flows.
Yeah, can I push you both on that? So you buried a phrase in that response just there. You threw away the phrase commercially oriented. So China's not the only country with state-owned enterprises or with a state sector. There are lots of countries. India has a state sector. Taiwan has a state sector. Norway had Statoil. Malaysia has a state sector. But the question of whether you run a state firm for commercial purposes or for political purposes seems to me not just to be a central one, but it also gets to a whole variety of issues around the relationship between ownership and control, right? You could have state ownership, but for example, external supervision of management exercised by a commercially oriented corporate board, rather than, as you just said, by a more politically attuned Communist Party committee that's embedded within the enterprise. So years ago, they had these corporate board pilots that they were doing in China for state firms. And I think to Yukon's point, my perception has been that those have been kind of short-circuited, and where they're going is toward not necessarily running state firms more commercially, but to having some of these political impulses at minimum not being reduced. And that's being reinforced by a lack of corporate governance reform in the state. So what does state-owned enterprise reform look like? If you're advising Li Keqiang, or if you're thinking about the pathway, I mean, obviously there are debates about the state sector in China. There's minimalist views, maximalist views. What does the pathway look like for them to reform the state sector? Is it corporate governance reform? Is it just letting these go? You know, there have been these local, for Guangxi non-ferrous, they let that one go. There have been a couple of these bankruptcies. So for Michael and then for Yukon, what does state sector reform really look like? And how, given how many people are saying there is no state sector reform really happening in China?
I think there's a lot of confusion about the role of the state sector. There's no reason the state sector under the right corporate governance framework can't engage in just as productive activity as the private sector. Of course, we have to change the definition of productive activity to include externalities. That's the real reason you want a state sector rather than a private sector, is because presumably externalities are pretty significant and the private sector can't capture them. So that's fine. I think the problem in China, though, is that there really isn't any sort of, you know, you can create boards of directors, commercial looking boards of directors, but it isn't very clear that they have a lot of power to direct the direction of the business. I myself was on the board of directors of a joint European Chinese company, and ultimately when my term expired, I asked not to be reappointed. And the reason was because it was pretty clear to me that there was absolutely nothing that the board was doing. The chairman decided on everything, and we just had really nice dinners and visited pretty cities. And that was about it. But does that really matter? I'm not sure it does. What I would argue is that the state sector and this, you know, going after externalities is not an absolute thing. It depends on underlying conditions. And I would have said that in the 1980s and 1990s, when China, you know, after 5 decades, 6 decades of anti-Japanese wars, civil war, and Maoism, was hugely underinvested, there was an enormous amount of investment that needed to be done, much of the benefits of which came through externalities. The private sector wouldn't have done it. In that case, it made a lot of sense to have a very, very strong state sector. The problem now is that we're locked with the strong state sector. And what we really need in order for growth is not additional infrastructure and capturing additional externalities, which I think at this point are very low. What we really need is real demand to drive the private sector to invest productively. And that's what I don't think we have. And we know all the standard problems, a very low consumption share, and excessive reliance on exports in a world which has turned very anti-trade, et cetera. So again, what I would argue is that all of this other talk about SOE reform, et cetera, to me is pretty secondary. China's problems are pretty straightforward. It has incredibly unbalanced domestic demand, largely because of major distortions in the distribution of domestic income. In fact, 2 weeks ago, my new book with Matt Klein came out on exactly that topic. And I would argue that until you resolve that problem, the other problems, you know, we've been talking about them for 10, 15 years. We've been taking all sorts of directions one way or another. But the one thing they haven't done is really redistributed domestic income. And until that happens, we're going to get this very non-productive growth and the surge in debt. And there's really not much we can do about it.
So I'm starting to get some questions from our audience, but Yukon, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on that too.
Well, let me just add that many of the principles that people suggest in dealing with the problem are out there. The government's tried to create lists of commercial enterprises, which in some sense shouldn't be in the state sector, and those with strategic or security interests, which remain or should be continue to be in the state sector. You also have people who are very much concerned with the fact that in this push to become more innovative, to be more technology sophisticated, the sense is that a lot of the support and effort needs to be done in large companies, large state companies. The reality, of course, is that much of this has been occurring in private companies, so there's a contradiction in there. There's a principle of what I call competitive neutrality, which governments have proposed globally to say, how do you deal with the performance of state enterprises so that they're not discriminatory? And China has indicated a willingness to talk about that as a principle to apply. But the influence on the state enterprises comes through all sorts of means which are not easy to deal with or to quantify. I think that the primary things you can do in the short term is there continues to be a huge number of state-owned enterprises, primarily in the provincial areas, operating in very clear commercial activities, and their presence, their sheer presence makes it difficult for the private sector to expand, because they basically say, if I try to expand, do something, I may in fact run into unfair competition with state entities. And that, I think, is a major constraint. So for me, the simplest thing the government has to do in the beginning is to repeat what they did 10 or 20 years ago. They basically have to say, there are all these kinds of small companies, state-owned, affiliated in some way. They are retarding the expansion of the private sector. Let's basically let them go and stop funding them and basically diversify. The more sensitive strategic security companies and activities, I don't see that changing in the near term. This is a global problem now because of what I would call global pressures in terms of these kinds of activities and the push to become more innovative.
So your view of the pathway is that they need a more minimalist view of what the state sector does. Essentially, it's strategic industries, natural monopolies, and then all these state firms that are doing things that are not really at the core identified strategic aims of the state, of which there are many. They just let them go. And when you say let them go, you mean bankruptcies and
bankruptcies, disintegrate them. They did this 20 years ago. You take a lot of these research companies, lots of consulting companies. That's what they did in the state sector, the government sector. They took all these departments and bodies, which had potentially commercial activities, basically say, let's not keep it in the state. You guys have to earn your own income. You basically have to fund your own activities. They essentially privatized them. And essentially, I think the same is true. You just let them go.
Okay, so that actually gets to some of the questions that we're starting to get from the audience. So I'll start to throw some of these at you. So there's a broad one here. There's some broad ones and there's some narrow ones. So one of the broader ones is whether COVID-19 has created opportunities rather than constraints for Beijing to advance economic reforms that were previously stalled due to political or practical reasons, right? So on something like what you just said, bankruptcies, most people would say, oh, but there's a political constraint. And COVID's exacerbated that political constraint because of the reason we said at the beginning, which is they're worried about employment, they're worried about stability. They don't want to lay people off out of these enterprises at a time when you have a supposedly employment first policy. So maybe we start with Michael, but as you think about kind of the world after the pandemic, has the pandemic itself created opportunities to advance reforms? And what are those and what's the connection?
Yes, and in exactly the same way that trade war was supposed to create opportunities to advance reform. And it's interesting to look at the comparisons because the whole purpose of trade war was, or the whole argument that trade war might help China finally do the rebalancing that it needed to do for so many years, was that if China couldn't export its excess domestic production, then it was limited to resolving domestic demand deficiencies domestically, that is through consumption and investment. And because we know, I mean, you can roughly divide up, there's two types of investment in China. There's the state sector investment, which is almost all non-productive increases in unnecessary infrastructure. And then there's private sector investment, but the private sector depends very heavily on consumption demand and on exports. So the argument was that to the extent that you remove the safety valve of current account surplus, trade surplus, exports, et cetera, that would put increasing pressure on Beijing to focus on rebalancing domestic demand. And Beijing has known that they needed to do this since 2007. This is not a new story. They've just been unable to do it. And if you look at what happened during the period of the trade conflict, there's been almost no forward movement on that. So exactly the same arguments came out about COVID-19. Okay, COVID-19 is devastating. It's going to force a significant rebalancing of demand within China because that's the only way out of this problem. great. And, in fairness, it's probably too early to say whether they've been doing it or not. But certainly so far, there is no evidence that we are seeing them use COVID to force through the kind of rebalancing that a lot of economists in China have been calling for. You can broadly divide the policy debate, the economic policy debate, between two groups. Those who are more concerned about slowing growth and those who are more concerned about rising debt. And the latter group has been arguing for a while now that you must rebalance income. And the only way to rebalance income, when you boil it down to its basics, is that there must be wealth transfers or income transfers from the state sector to the household sector, for political reasons, probably from local governments to the household sector. And there have been a lot of proposals to do so, but as I said at the beginning of this presentation, those proposals have been more talked about than acted on. China still has, as a default policy, to focus on expanding the supply side. If they do that, then they will not be able to take advantage of COVID-19 to rebalance the economy. If COVID-19 puts pressure on them to do so, and they really do start to do major transfers of wealth domestically, then that will be a move in the right direction. But we've been talking about this for literally since 2007. So I think we have to wait and see if they actually implement the necessary policies.
Yukon, do you see COVID as an action forcing event?
COVID will certainly change the modalities of businesses, change the relationship between the state and businesses, but not necessarily in the direction that people would hope for. It's true even in the United States. What have we done so far? We've basically pushed out a lot more money through the state or through the governments to provide social programs, employment support, funding to enterprises. And in many ways, the outcome is that the state plays a greater role, and that's because the private sector is being hurt by the pandemic. The other thing we're seeing, I think we're going to see this globally, and we're going to see it in China. COVID-19 essentially is going to result in small informal activities suffering a lot. Many of them cannot come back. So the consolidation that takes place means that the bigger companies, the chain companies, the large companies will survive, and they will buy up assets. Equity markets are booming because people realize at the end of this process of money flowing, it's going to support the big. Big in China is state enterprises, and some of the internet companies, they're going to flourish. So I don't think that the COVID is going to help on this question of private, public kinds of concerns. There are activities which have flourished, medical supplies, for example. And you see all these companies trying to get into these areas. Many of them are private, and many of them, of course, are boom or bust, and many of them are not doing a very good job. So you have a lot of that kind of churning going on. I think there are other issues that now will happen, but we don't know their impact. Is the pattern of urbanization going to change in China? Are people going to decide they don't want to live in big cities anymore and the concentration? Are there migrant workers who can't find jobs? Are they going to end up going to different kinds of areas? The government has been trying to push them into smaller cities and discourage them from going to the big cities. Will this change because of the pandemic? And we don't actually know. Now, what does the government try to do? The government, just before the Party Congress, came out with various kinds of initiatives to strengthen what they would call market forces in the economy. And I would cite basically two. One of them was to start to loosen up on the hukou residency system, to let people basically get residency rights. And when they get residency rights, they consume more and they invest more. But they're still rather tepid. They still have a lot of restrictions. They still have a bias in terms of your ability to move to the big cities. And my own view is that this kind of restriction in a time of major recession is constraining. So that's got to basically change. They also try to tackle this question of land reform in rural areas. Basically, all land is owned by the state. Farmers and rural people have use rights, but they can't monetize it. They can't sell it. And they're trying to figure out a way so they can actually capitalize on their use rights, get rid of it, and then be able to move. So I think one of the issues that has to be addressed, and the COVID is actually basically accelerating the debate, can I improve the mobility of households and workers? Because I don't know where they're going to find jobs, and the pattern of those jobs may change. China is becoming much more focused internally rather than externally because of the trade war and because of what's happening. And that means it's going to be more services oriented. And if it's more services oriented, it probably means that the central provinces, which account for about a third of the population, will be in a relative sense become more important because they can serve both the West, which has 1/3, and the coastal is 1/3. So a more domestically oriented economy in some way means a greater focus in the central portions, and that changes the pattern of investment. And the COVID is actually is going to spur this forward. So I think there are a number of complicated forces going on, but it's too early right now to tell the outcome of all these interactions.
But so we're starting to run short on time, and we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to ask a couple of these, and we'll see where you want to take them. This one seems particularly relevant for Michael. Somebody's asking about the demand side in China. Essentially, what are the top policies available to China to sustainably reflate demand, basically boost demand, notwithstanding the political constraints? If you could put political constraints to the side, what are the two things you'd recommend to reflate demand? And then for Yukon, particularly as your former World Bank country director, not just for China, but for former Soviet countries, which include places like Kyrgyzstan, that are among the most indebted to China. And Kyrgyzstan always had debt, not just to China. How do you view this announcement the other day, a little bit vague, that we're going to look either at maybe debt restructuring, it could have been debt forgiveness, it was a little ambiguous, but dealing with some of the debt payment problems from countries that they've lent money to, either through the Belt and Road or more generally. So Michael, why don't we start with you on the demand side? And you can both jump in on those also.
Yeah, on the demand side, there really isn't anything very complicated about what they need to do to boost demand. Yukon mentioned some of them. If you eliminate the hukou system, which they're not going to do, every time you discuss it, everyone says, yes, it's a great idea, but we can't do it now, it's too difficult. But if you eliminate the hukou system, you immediately increase the income of migrant workers tremendously, because they now have access to a whole new raft of social services, and you reduce the wealth of the local municipalities to which the migrants go. It's a classic transfer of wealth. If you strengthen the social safety net, something the World Bank and the IMF have been for a while, the problem they don't talk about how to fund it. They talk about a sort of social safety net. It can be funded by transfers from the house, which is how it was 10 years ago. It did no good at all. It funded by increases in government debt, which, since the whole point is to resolve the debt problem, you don't really solve it by changing the locus of debt. Or it can be funded by the liquidation assets on the part of local governments, and we sort of know that it's very difficult to do it. There are a million types of transfers. For example, Shanghai, or a little over a year ago, that's that Shanghai SOEs would issue new shares to the hukou residents, of course, in those SOEs, and that's a basic transfer. The ownership of Shanghai gets diluted, the ownership of workers goes up, so there's a wealth-to-wealth transfer. There's many ways you can do it. But what China has been focusing on is ways of boosting consumption without focusing on the real reason why consumption's up, and that's an income reason. So, you hear talk about need to improve the quality of service, we need to improve consumption logistics, we need to keep shops open later at night, and that's all nonsense. That's not how you boost consumption. Consumption is constrained by the lack of income. That's what constrains consumption. China has the lowest household income share of GDP per capita in history. So not surprisingly, they have this consumption share. But the problem is, whenever you look at the solutions all involve the same thing: wealth transfers from local governments and local elites, and that's politically a very difficult process. Let me just say one thing that they were able to do, and it's not a coincidence that this was politically quite easy to do, is Shandong province 2 years ago announced that it would transfer ownership of shares in Shandong SOEs to the Shandong Pension Fund. Now this they were able to do is they continue controlling the companies when they're held by the pension funds. but it's had almost no impact on consumption, even though in theory it's a real transfer of wealth. But the reason it has no impact on consumption is because if I give you $100, you will feel $100 richer, and maybe your consumption will go up. If I put $100 in your pension fund, do you feel $100 richer, and will you spend more? Well, it depends on the credibility of the pension fund. And I would argue the credibility is quite low, so it's had very little impact. But when you look at the range of steps they've taken, and you see that we know what to do. We've been discussing this. Everyone's been discussing this for years. Most importantly, hukou reform. Or the other really big proposal is municipalities should create low-income housing and just give it to the poor. But it's been very, very tough to pull that off, probably for political reasons. But they're all the same solution. That's the point that I would make.
Great. So Yukon, we're nearly at the hour, so I'll let you bring us home for a minute or two on the indebtedness question and China's overseas relationships as well.
Well, the debt problem has become a major issue for the Beijing to focus on, and it comes from the Belt and Road Initiative. And many foreign observers have said that the Belt and Road Initiative has created a debt problem for many of these countries which have benefited or been the recipients of China's investments and loans over the past 4 or 5 years. To be fair, their debt problem wasn't created by the Belt and Road Initiative. Their borrowings have been going on for many, many years. But the BRI certainly made it a bit worse. And lack of transparency in terms of actually made it difficult for people to know what China is doing, and it's created a lot of suspicion. Now you have the COVID crisis. Debt to GDP ratios are soaring. Many of the relatively advanced, well-off countries don't have an issue, but fragile states, poor countries do have a debt problem. And so you have this kind of global coordinated effort to reduce the debt burdens for these countries. And for the first time, China basically is drawn into this discussion because generally it prefers to deal with it as a bilateral issue, not as part of a global debt reduction program. And China, I think, has no alternative because of the politics involved, but to agree to basically a moderation in debt reduction for many of these countries and to scale back its lending in terms of its BRI programs in the coming years.
Great. Well, we're right up against the hour. We do have more questions, and I'm hoping that, well, let me ask one more question. And the reason there's feedback is somebody didn't mute their audio, so we're hearing me talking probably into Yukon's screen. I'm going to ask you one more question. Let me ask you one more question because we still have a bunch. This one's for Michael. Could you elaborate? Well, let me just read the question. Could you elaborate on misconceptions on state sector expansion? And the questioner says, well, this is a question again about political control as opposed to commercial function. This is something that you kind of addressed earlier. So let me just broaden the question. I'll just broaden the question a little bit. Can you talk about politics as an impulse in the economy? The whole idea of political interference in the economy in China. How much is politics a constraint? Not just in terms of reform, but on everything from resource allocation to the ability to make the kinds of changes they need. Or to put that a little bit differently, is reform in China an intellectual problem, or is it just a political problem? Where you've got plenty of people that understand perfectly well the kind of reforms that need to be done, but politics just get in the way, whether, as this questioner asked, on state sector reform or on other things too. They just either don't have the political stomach, or as in many places, India, Europe, even the United States, politics has become a constraint on things that if they were played out as intellectual debates, actually you'd be able to get big policy and structural changes. Just to maybe say something about the role of politics in the economy, which is where the question.
This is an old question, and one of my favorite economists, unfortunately, he's not very much read in China or in Asia, is Albert Hirschman. Asked that question way back in the late 1970s or early 80s, and his observation was that developing countries very often put into place extremely successful growth models. And those growth models correct whatever the imbalances were domestically that they corrected, generally that they were underinvested in manufacturing capacity and in infrastructure. So this really applies now. But at some point, once they've closed the gap, what they need to do is to abandon that particular growth model and focus on a completely different set of reforms, the institutional reform. But they never did so, according to Hirschman, and it was why. Are they to see what they need to do? And he said no, because if you look at the debate, you see they clearly had at some point the need for a transformation of the growth model. The problem was that an existing model, particularly one that's very useful, has certain constituencies that benefit tremendously from that growth model. And the difficulty has always been in getting them to a significant transformation in the model. And as you can see, this is not a problem. This is a general. We could argue that in the huge success financial system created constraints in our ability to adjust the financial system in ways that would be much better for the economy. So China is facing a very old problem, a very common problem. Fortunately, as Hirschman reminds us, the history is so glum. It's very difficult to overcome the resistance to the necessary reforms. And in the case of China, where you had this imbalanced longest period of time, you've had GDP growing quite quickly, household growing much more slowly. So some groups, local governments, local elites, benefited spectacularly from 30 years ago. And now they're very powerful and very influential players within the political system. So I would say that it was absolutely right. It's a political problem. It's not that nobody knows we do.
Great. Yukon, I'm going to let you jump in on that. That'll give you the last word as well.
The question is, are politics becoming more important in influencing economic reform policies in a negative way than previous decades? And I think the answer is yes. Let's go back 20, 30 years ago and ask the question, why did China do so well economically, grow 10% a year? And the answer is the politics and what I call good economics basically complemented each other. Because at a low income level, you grow very rapidly through industrial expansion, large infrastructure projects, mobilizing the efforts of the people on a few, what I call few simple activities. So this kind of China political economic system, extremely efficient and does it very, very well. Now you have an upper middle income economy. You cannot rely upon what I call pure investment, pure basic industries, pure infrastructure building roads. You're much more oriented to finance, services, innovation, different kinds of activities, many kinds of small firms and new firms, and they are not amenable to what I call the role of the state playing a dominant role. So the clash between what I call a strong state and the kinds of economic initiatives you need, they become much more contradictory today than they were several decades ago. And that's why we see this kind of a political question becoming what I would call seeing as a more negative impact than it was, let's say, 2 decades ago. Let me stop there.
Great. Well, that's a terrific place to kind of bring this to a close. I want to say 3 things at the end. First, to the audience, it's a brave new world, this digital convening. So we apologize for the audio, but thanks for sticking with it. And the audience means everything to us. It's your participation that really makes the difference for our work. And so we thank you for joining us. To the guys, thanks. It's our honor to have you be senior fellows with us at Carnegie. And we appreciate your insights. And I encourage everybody, since, as I said at the beginning, they're both very prolific, I encourage you to read their work. And it's all available on the Carnegie website. Last thing I'll say is just about Carnegie. You will have noticed that Michael's in Beijing and Yukon's in Washington. Carnegie, we call ourselves the global think tank. And indeed we are. We have Carnegies in Beirut and Moscow and Brussels and New Delhi and Beijing and Washington. And all of them, in one way or another, are working on different aspects of China's role in the world. China raises a whole series of global questions, global issues. And so that's it's the beauty. I've been at Carnegie a little over a year, and it's the beauty of Carnegie is we have really a global take on it and people all over the world working on it. So I encourage you not just to take a look at the Asia program website of the Carnegie Endowment on carnegieendowment.org, but also of the Carnegie Tsinghua Center and our other centers as well. You'll see a lot of interesting stuff on the Chinese economy and China's role in the world generally. So Michael, Yukon, with that, thanks so much for doing this. We appreciate it, and have a terrific day. And thanks everybody for joining us.